So I want to take a step back and say that let's look at the form. I've jotted down a few things because otherwise one forgets. Four major things that has been reported. I haven't, I must confess, listened to the finance minister from beginning to end. I have not, repeat, not read the economic survey from beginning to end. I'll do that gradually. There's no hurry. Four things which are mentioned are energy transition, climate action. I see those two things as related. If energy transition means getting out of fossil fuels to the extent possible and reducing our dependence on coal, I may have some differences of opinion as to what is the pace at which we should do it, but nobody can object to these broad objectives of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Inclusive development, motherhood and apple pie. I would like, I'm sure, so would everyone else in India, want development which is inclusive rather than exclusive. Another thing which was talked about, I'm talking about broad subject heads, was productivity enhancement. Now, productivity enhancement, we have been talking about also for decades. And for decades, if not longer, we have been saying that this also depends upon the state of public health facilities, to the extent that even people from weaker economic sections have access to health care, which is affordable. One is not necessarily saying that it has to be free for all income groups which are below the middle class, because it may not be affordable for the central government or the state governments. And the other obvious thing is primary education, the 3 R's, the reading, writing, and arithmetic. As one economist mentioned, I think with some exaggeration, that China had achieved its primary health and primary education levels that India has today somewhere around 1975. That is 1 year before Mao Zedong passed away. And of course, the Gang of Four had already taken over, including his then wife. Now, my sense is that, this is a media creation, this hype about the annual budget, because and all of us know that you have to work 365 days a year. I mean, obviously, there are some holidays in between, but you can't be focused on the budget as if this is what will deliver growth and sustainable growth for India, along with employment and productivity rise. So for the media, this is a good thing because it sells copy. Everybody then switches on their television tonight to listen to the gurus talking about what is going to happen. But the hard back-breaking work has to be done in the rest of the year. Now, having said that, let's look at a few numbers. Growth next year, 9.27. I mean, this level of accuracy is spurious. 9.27, second place of decimal, let's leave it. Is it 9? Is it 8? Well, 8.5, at least 5 points of decimal you should. So again, for those who are knowledgeable, all this is old hat. But I'm talking as if I'm talking to a generalist audience. Fiscal deficit for last year, that is 21-22, last fiscal year, has been estimated. Of course, as you know, as everybody knows, these numbers get revised several times. So we'll get revised estimates, we'll get re-revised estimates, and so on. As of today, the finance minister has announced last fiscal year, it's not yet over because it will continue till 31st of March, is estimated at 6.7, next year 6.4. Now, I don't think that these numbers are something we should be alarmed with. The fiscal hawks keep referring to the FRBM and how we have slipped from our goal of 3%, etc. All that is good, and I completely appreciate, and I think it's important to be fiscally conservative and to be fiscally responsible. But at the same time, we all know, I think in March 2020, the Prime Minister announced a lockdown, I think somewhere around 21st, 22nd. Today, we are sitting on the 1st of February. For all practical purposes, it's now 2 full calendar years and effectively 2 full fiscal years that we have had this this horrible thing called COVID-19 looming over our heads, with all the concomitant, with all the problems that it has caused, mostly for our unorganized labor. in urban areas. And to that extent, if the government has had to go beyond its fiscal deficit targets of yesteryear under FRBM, so be it. I have no problem with that. In fact, I would be prepared to be even more aggressive with this. But unfortunately, as again, it's been well publicized, well written about, that most of the effort by government has been subordinated to the effort made by Reserve Bank of India to put in a lot of rupee liquidity into the system. Now, that does not necessarily help the migrant labor who have gone back to villages. So there I feel a little disappointed. As far as taxes are concerned, I noticed that there is this 2% surcharge on people who have more than $1 billion. So I think 99.9% of the people in India will say, I say it's okay. Come on, you guys are worth more than $1 billion US. So that is 7,500 crores. If you give 2%, you can earn more than that on a portion of your money by putting them into Government of India securities, and you still be well sort of taken care of. So that's fine. It's but I mean, they're claiming that it's going to bring in 1.1 lakh crores. I'm not quite sure whether it will or will not. But if you look at our public sector banks and their balance sheets and so on, so there's a lot of repairing to be done. And while it looks like a large amount of money at one go, it's not all that money, and I'm not quite sure how repeatable it is and so on. Will it be every year? So how will it work? Will you increase it? I'm not saying that this is equivalent to soak the rich. You know how in the past, particularly during Indira Gandhi's time, income taxes had gone to 95, 96%. So obviously nobody wants to earn anything. If you're going to take 96 or 95% of every 100 rupees I earn, why would I keep any, keep making effort to earn more money? Now let us switch to something which I think others have also commented on in the economic survey. Because my antenna are more out on capital markets issues, I noticed that there was some talk about FX reserves. Now, FX reserves are roughly, give or take, 650 billion US dollars right now. Our total FX debt is about 550. So you might say, well, so big deal. So, not all that debt is going to be called tomorrow. If you look at residual maturity, about 250 billion of that has a residual maturity of 1 year. I'm not saying that this is, as you know, short-term debt is defined as debt which is 1 year or less in maturity. So when I say residual maturity, if you had debt which was initially 10 years of maturity, but now only 365 days have left because 9 years have elapsed. So it is still for me short-term debt, because short-term debt is 1 year maturity. If you define debt as that with residual maturity of 1 year or less, it's about 250 billion. Now, so we still have 450 billion of reserves. Even if all that debt were to fall, and then one has to look at the maturity buckets over the next 1 year. My concern, as with many other people, as people have noticed that as the US Federal Reserve has been talking about raising rates, so what has actually happened? I think about 77 basis points. So that is, for those who don't follow that term of basis points, is 0.77%. Is the amount the 10-year US government bond has gone up in terms of its interest rate, what it is currently trading at. So that is the reflection of the concern that the Fed has. It is trying to clamp down on liquidity. And given inflation, which are high by any standards in the US, and definitely by historical standards, 5% and above, one CPI number came out at 6%. So if, and I've noticed this before, as we all remember the taper tantrum of 2013, moment interest rates go up in the US, some FIIs who are looking at the return on any of their equity and debt investments in India, coupled with country risk, what they look upon us as sovereign risk, country risk, which is not quantifiable. So you can't say it is worth 2% or 3%. Once there's a default, there is no such thing as the interest rate being higher helping you, as we know from multiple examples of Latin America, including Argentina. So there is that issue, and that is to some extent is what has sparked off a little bit of sell-off in the Indian equity markets. But today, as you know, equity market was up by 850 points. It began about 800 points high, then it came right down to the level of yesterday while the finance minister was talking. So maybe there was something there that people were a little concerned about. And by the end, those concerns seem to have disappeared. Just to tell you that, how fickle all this is in terms, don't look at stock markets to understand macro issues is what I would suggest to everybody, because this is a small market in terms of the total number of investors and the total number of stocks in Sensex and Nifty. Nifty 50 has 50, that Nifty also has a 500 and so on. But Sensex is only 30 stocks. So, it's the same few stocks that everybody chases. And nowadays with this dependence on IT for everyone, whether you are a student, whether you are working in an office, the fact that we are communicating using IT, all that has meant that IT stocks have gone up. But those are just a handful, the same TCS, Infosys, Wipro, etc. This doesn't show any great health of the economy as a whole. And talking about IT and so on, there's this talk about making the rupee as something cyber rupee or whatever it is. I mean, all this is very good. This sounds good because it's relatively easy to do, but it doesn't affect anything at the macro level. It doesn't do anything for those 80 million plus people who went back from urban areas to rural areas, and where they have 1 acre or something amongst 3 brothers, and 2 of them came away to urban areas because that 1 acre or 1.5 acre or even 1 hectare, which is 2.5 acres, is enough to feed the entire 3 families of the 3 brothers. So some of them have gone back, some of them are here. I don't see enough attention has been paid, given the shocks that demonetization. I don't think GST, anyone should blame the government for. Any major initiative like GST will have teething trouble because people have to get used to how it works, and no amount of blaming of Infosys is just, that blaming of Infosys is not justified. I think even Infosys must have learned in the process. We are talking about large numbers here, and we all know what kind of constraints we work with. Power goes off, you can have backup power, you can do this, that, and the other. And GST, I say, is okay because I think last month we have collected 140 something plus crores. So it's finally finding its feet. But forget about the political and other criticism of demonetization. It did affect MSMEs, and particularly the smallest of those MSMEs very hard, because many of them depend upon cash, because the people they deal with, whether it is a consumer or whether it is a supplier, they have no other means but to deal in cash. I mean, think of a vegetable seller or somebody who's even bringing in vegetables from some other place in a tempo or some other vehicle. So it becomes very difficult. So I have a feeling that, it's high time. It's more than high time. I don't agree with Mr. Chidambaram, who says that, look at this number. You've seen his comment that you have come back to where you were 2 years ago. But 2 years, I just discussed, we had COVID. Come on, you have to cut the government slack on that. Every government around the world has been struggling to deal with this terrible menace with the kind of, we can again agree or disagree on how well the government handled it. But this is a fact that even today, services are struggling. By services, I mean anything to do with restaurants, any kind of activity, which means people have to gather at some place. I mean, I think only very recently, Delhi, the weekend curfew has been lifted, if I'm right. So if you're going to have weekend curfew, weekend is when people go out to do various things, and traveling must have reduced, etc., etc. So to that extent, I don't think any criticism of the government is justified. I don't see enough in the budget on the defense side, given our defense needs. And I won't get into numbers there. I don't see enough on the railways side, because these are 2 areas which suck up a lot of our resources. And we need to look at that to see carefully what do we really need in terms of railways. As we all know, in the public sector, the largest employer. And have we thought through everything to do with railways over the next 10, 15, 20 years? Because that's the kind of time frame that you need to have. And there it goes back to my first point, that you can't in one budget on one day look at railways, which is so huge, and map out what you're going to do over the next 10, 15 years, because this government may or may not be there. They are going to look at the most, whether we like it or not, till the next general elections. That's what. And maybe a lot of the things that we see in the budget today may be even aimed at the state elections, which are going to, election results are going to come around 10th of March or something like that. Again, I don't blame this. All governments have to deal, and this is both India or elsewhere, who have to deal with these issues. So capital markets don't look there for macro. I think by and large, this 4.2% of GDP is what the finance minister has announced would be the capital expenditure. All very good, but where, how? I mean, this talk about production-linked incentives, I don't feel very comfortable about it. I know that some others also don't feel comfortable, because we've done this in the past. And then it goes, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the idea, but ideas have to be implemented. And who will you give that production linked incentive? How will you monitor that that incentive was actually used? As we all know, a lot of the baggage, the NPA baggage that our public sector banks have on their books is because certain companies have really been very, very underhand in the way that they have worked. I mean, they take huge loans, 10,000, 20,000 crores worth, and they have inflated the project cost. And when they find that whatever they were planning to do is not going to work, they start siphoning off assets, etc., etc. So we know all this. And in fact, public sector banks still need hand-holding over the next several years, not just one or two, but maybe the next 5. So to again talk about production-linked incentives, I'm not too sure. When it comes to things like housing for the poor, a certain amount, I think 40,000 crores has been suggested, and so on. All that is very good. And there is something about water to the people in rural areas. I think it is some null says something is the term. You know, there are so many of these acronyms that it becomes difficult to remember. So that's all very good, because if you can give piped water, to that extent, the lady of the house in a rural area doesn't have to, in those traditional old Hindi movies with vessels on their heads, walking to the nearby lake or river and getting contaminated water because there is fecal matter in the water because of whatever, people defecating out in the open. So to the extent that you have latrines coming up and people start using them, to the extent that you can give piped water which has been treated, all very good, because it feeds into what I said about public health. Primary education, I don't see much here in terms of the budget, in terms of getting bang for the amount of rupees that you're going to put in. What are you going to do which is different? Because we know that from the past that many things which have been done have not really worked. I'll stop there because I think I've spoken long enough. And thank you, whoever was or is listening to me.